Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project with your host Mick Spears. We bring you thought-provoking guests and topics every week to challenge your thinking about leadership. Our aim is to help you become the leader that you wish you always had as we learn together and lead together. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. We have two very special guests with us today, and they're return guests. We have Alisa and Tony DiLorenzo, and you'd remember them from a previous episode that we did about what leadership lessons you can learn from One Extraordinary Marriage. And they are the hosts of the world's leading marriage podcast. They are the authors of the book called The 6 Pillars of Intimacy, which is what we spoke about last time. But since they've last been on the show, they've launched a new book about the 6 pillars of intimacy, but now about conflict resolution and how to break the cycles of conflict resolution for a healthier marriage. Just like last time, we're going to explore that. And there's going to be lots of tips for you today that will help you to improve your personal relationships. But just like we did last time, we're also going to extrapolate into the workplace, because when we talk about managing conflict at home, some of the same context, the same cycles turn up in the workplace as well. So I'm really excited about today's discussion. They're dear friends of ours on the show. They are an inspiration to us as authors, as thought leaders, as people that are out there helping other human beings live amazing lives and creating extraordinary marriages themselves. So it's a great honor to have them back on the show. So Alisa and Tony, thank you so much for your time again today. We're going to have to do this one a little bit different because you've been on the show before, so I'm not going to go through the whole backstory. We did that last time. So let's just start with, what has changed in your life, apart from obviously a new book, what has changed in your life since we last spoke?
Well, we continue to get a little bit older, like the entire audience here. We're about to really just see some huge transitions as our daughter is about to become a high school senior.
Yeah.
And so we are rapidly approaching the empty nest phase of life. And with that, seeing, growth within the business as well. It's interesting how when you're going through personal transitions, it can also play out into business and professional transitions as well. And so a lot of that is happening right now.
Excellent. Congratulations on your success. First of all, since we last spoke, the 6 Pillars of Intimacy was a wonderful success. You've got your podcast, you've got your business where you're helping couples through marriage counseling, but also through your group workshops, which I think is an amazing product as well. So congratulations on your success. Then I've read the new book about conflict resolution, and it's once again full of wonderful tips, things that people can practically go and implement immediately, at the same time as sharing some of your own personal perspectives, your own personal backstory. So congratulations on your success. I feel really honored that we're friends and really proud of you in terms of the way that you're going about this. Can I ask why conflict resolution? Why was that the next book?
That was the next book. This book was really birthed out of a conversation that Tony and I had, probably about a year ago now. And, just talking about the themes that I would see in my coaching sessions. And I've done, thousands and thousands. I don't even know how many thousands of hours of coaching sessions. And there's one theme in every single coaching session. There's some element of conflict between spouses in the relationship that needs to be worked out. And I started seeing these patterns. And one day, probably about a year ago, Tony's like, why aren't we making this available to everyone? For the person that might not show up, might not be ready to start coaching, why not put something in their hands that equips them on a practical level to at least give them the beginning tools, even if they never get into a coaching session? And that's really where the book was birthed.
Yeah. And from a place of the 6 Pillars of Intimacy, the first book in the series, we talk a lot about cracks and strengthening those pillars. Mm-hmm. Well, when there are cracks in those pillars, usually there's conflict. Well, how are we going to strengthen this pillar? And so a lot of couples, as they're looking at those pillars, going, what are we doing? And inevitably conflict arises. And so helping them to see the framework of the 6 Pillars of Intimacy, but not get discouraged, be able to resolve that conflict and continue to strengthen their marriage.
Yeah, I can see that, Tony. So, let's pick one of them and go the financial intimacy. I can imagine that being a huge element of either unresolved conflict or conflict that emerges on a regular basis. It's either sitting there dormant and no one's talking about it and it's a source of...
Big elephant in the room.
Yeah, exactly. A hidden conflict, or it could be explosive. And I mean that not in the kind of physical way or anything like that, but it could be something that is the topic that every month comes back to haunt the couple because, with the bills again here, and there's something that they're not talking about. So, yeah, I love this thought about this cracks, that if you want to get intimate, you've got to address the things that are keeping you from being not intimate around those topics.
When we're in relationship with another human being, there's always an opportunity for conflict because they're not going to be just like us. And, as you're bringing up the example of finances, whether it was something that we saw growing up, if it's beliefs that we have about money that maybe we haven't talked about, it's expectations around finances, until we build the communication and the bridges to one another, there are going to be those conflicts there. And it can feel, almost irreconcilable if we don't do something about it. We can get into this place of just saying, well, that's just the way I am, or that's just the way you are, instead of saying, how do we look for solutions to actually strengthen the relationship and be able to face the problem instead of seeing the person that we're in relationship with as the problem?
This word communication, I think that's going to be a key one as we go through the conversation today. I'm going to go on a bit of a trip here for a second. I'm going to share with you one of my favourite stories. And I think this is an example of unsurfaced conflict that eventually then blows up. So one of my favourite stories is about a couple. They've been married for 30 years. Every morning they love to wake up to the smell of freshly baked bread in the house. So they've got one of those bread makers now. In the old times, they used to do it in an oven, but now they've got one of those modern things. They put all the mix in at the night before, and they set a timer, and they wake up to the wafting smells through their house of freshly baked bread. And every morning for 30 years, the husband would get the loaf of bread, and he'd get out a big knife, and he'd cut off the crusty end of the bread and stick it on a plate and give it to his wife. And eventually, after 30 years of marriage, she says, "That's it. I've had enough. You've given me this crusty, chunky end of bread for the same day every morning for 30 years. I've had enough. I want a divorce." And he just turns to her and says, "But that's the best bit." So there's the example. It's like hidden conflict. I'm going to call it unresolved, unspoken about conflict for 30 years. And eventually it bursts out. And of course, the two of them, they're just making assumptions about each other. It was a love language for him. In a gift of service, he's saying, "I'm giving you my favorite bit of the bread." And she's going, "That jerk, he's done it again." What are your reflections on that story?
Well, when I hear that story, I think about the expectations that, clearly the wife had about getting the good part of the bread versus her not knowing and him not sharing. This is what I think is the best part. And so there's this breakdown here that they both are, and this happens a lot in conflict, right? We have our own thought patterns. We have our own beliefs. We have every experience that we've ever had in our own individual lives, and they come in and confront the other person, right? And so that's wherein lies the battle. And so if we aren't willing to step into a place of vulnerability, right? Point in time in that 30 years, she could have said, "Honey, I'm curious. Why do you always give me the end of the bread?" And he could have been like, "Oh my gosh, when I was growing up, this was always like in my house, I had 5 siblings and this was always the most coveted piece because it was crunchy and the way the butter, and whatever it might be. Or, my mom always got it and this was always the best piece and it always went to mom first and you are my queen." And so there could have been a lot of stories there that would have completely changed her perspective had she known or had he volunteered. But instead you have and this happens a lot with people in relationship, you can allow something to go on for years and years and years and years until you reach a breaking point and nobody realizes it was a breaking point because it was never discussed.
Yeah. I love that word curious, Alisa. So she could have stayed curious. Not she could have made this argument earlier. She could have stayed curious. She could have asked the questions. "Curious, baby, why do you give me that piece of bread?" I love that, Alisa. And I think that's where a lot of us can learn to get curious early and stay curious longer. Ask more questions. Yeah, really cool. You mentioned the word patterns before. So you said that in your sessions with either couples, sometimes individuals, sometimes the group sessions, you said that the same patterns keep emerging. Can you tell us more about what you meant there?
Yeah, I describe what I call the conflict cycle in the book. And this was the pattern that I would see, that there would be, this moment when conflict starts. I liken it to, the minute you realize the air in the room has changed, or all of a sudden the body language is maybe a little stiffer or a little abrupter. And so you get into that place of something just shifted. Maybe I'm aware of it. Maybe I'm not aware of it. Something's different. And that's where that conflict starts. And then the next phase is where it starts to escalate, right? It still feels like maybe we can save the situation, but it's definitely getting more heated. The body language is more intense. The language is more intense. We're watching the dynamic, trying to see if it's salvageable. Phase 3 is the boiling point, also the point of no return. That's when the greatest damage is being done, whether it's through the words that are being spoken, the actions that are being taken. This can be where somebody, if they're prone to being in that fight phase or fight presentation, that's when they will get loud and aggressive. If they're more prone to freezing, they will get very cold, withdrawn, maybe even leave the room if they tend to flee. Then you have some sort of cool down. And, that's where everybody's sort of, often phrase associated with this is walking on eggshells, right? Where you're just kind of like, oh, okay, I'm going to give you some distance. I'm going to take some distance. We're just going to kind of go into our own separate corners. And then the final phase is either a return to status quo or it's resolution. And the reason that's the final phase is because some people, whether we're talking corporate relationships or we're talking personal relationships, sometimes we don't actually resolve the problem. We just kind of sweep it under the rug and say, okay, we're just going to keep going on because we're not going to deal with that until we circle back around again. Getting to resolution takes courage, it takes vulnerability, and it takes intentionality.
So the pattern is the cycle. I imagine it shows up differently and in different speeds and different ways, but the pattern was the cycle. Okay, that's really interesting. And we touched on this on the last show, and we've almost touched on a little bit here as well. You talk in the book about know thyself and thinking about role models and what you've seen in the past about conflict resolution. And you tell great stories. Tony, you growing up in an Italian household where everything is quite open and vocal and loud, etc., and at least you didn't grow up in that kind of environment. How do we deal with, let's go one at a time, let's deal with the role model discussion first. So when we think about our parents or people in our lives and how we saw them deal with conflict, what does that mean for us?
Well, there's a lot of observational imprinting that happens when we're children, right? We're watching how the people in our lives do conflict. We're watching the result of that conflict. If we see, in my case, I saw my mom withdraw whenever my dad would even my dad wasn't a yeller, but if he slightly raised his voice and, you could tell in that tone of voice that there was displeasure there, my mom would withdraw. So I learned that when there's ever an elevated voice, that is code for withdraw, remove yourself, shut down, all of these kinds of things. I married a man whose family only did loud when there was any, like loud was happy, loud was angry, loud was sad, like they were just loud. And so anytime Tony elevated his voice, I was like, I'm done. I would just, pull back and withdraw. And so, this goes back to, the word that you had emphasized a few minutes ago, and that's stay curious. And I would encourage when you're in a relationship, specifically your personal relationships, to go, hey, what did you see? How was conflict handled when you were growing up? Because it's not one of those things that, like on a third date, you're like, so how did your parents fight? Generally not the conversation. But if you're going to be entering into a long-term relationship with someone, what did that look like in your family?
And it's something that Alisa and I had to learn over our 26 years of marriage. We've been married 26 years. We've known each other 29 years. This wasn't something that just, let's think about this. But over the years, as we grew, as we began to speak to the one family and recognize this, we are like, we're talking about this. And isn't it interestingly enough, as I say that, and Alisa's sharing what she saw, that's what played out for years and years in our marriage. And talking to others, Alisa, obviously with her coaching clients, I talk to many of folks when we're doing live events, and you hear what's going on and you're like, you got that, that was imprinted on you. You learned it, even though you didn't know it when you were 3 years old, 4 years old, 10 years old. You saw this play out over and over again. And you just take that into the relationship, into the marriage, going, well, this must be the way we deal with it. Interestingly enough, Alisa has done some talks and spoken in front of corporate and even learning there with folks who only grew up with a single parent and how they engage in conflict because they're like, I grew up with only one parent.
So there was no observation.
Yeah, that's interesting. It looks different. Doesn't mean there was no conflict, but it's going to show up differently. Yeah, interestingly. Okay, all right. Now, let's extrapolate that into the workplace. So we've spoken there about, let's say, intimate relationships and learning from your parents and role models that you had growing up. It could be your grandparents too, by the way, but those people around there you've seen, and it's a learned behavior, whether you know it or not. You might not even have the self-awareness. Like for Alisa, you might not have even realized that you were withdrawing as soon as Tony raised his voice, but you were doing it because that's what you almost inherently learnt from your mum, right? So now let's talk about the workplace. Our role models in the workplace are the leaders that came before us. What can we learn from watching those that came before us in a leadership role?
Well, I think it's very important to be mindful of how they handle conflict, right? Because just in the same way that as a child, you learn from your parents, when you enter the workforce, especially in the early years, when you're just, we have a 20-year-old son. So this is very relevant to us. I know that he is watching the owner of the company, his supervisors, and he's going to start learning, especially because he's so young in the workforce, how conflict is handled, what works, what doesn't, what he likes, what he doesn't. And the truth of the matter is that we all do it in the workplace. And as we move up, as we spend time in corporate settings, we're taking all of those bits and pieces of information. We're watching the people around us and we're internalizing that. And we have to be very mindful of how that shows up in our own leadership. Take the good parts, leave the bad parts.
But I think that's the key is the word, you used the word intentionality before and now you're using the word mindful. I think if we don't do it intentionally and mindfully, it's just going to become an implicitly learned behavior without having a stock take of, hey, did we even like that behavior? So Tony, you and I were chatting about this just before we started. When people land in their first leadership role, they often don't get a lot of leadership training at that stage. Leadership training sometimes comes later in their leadership style or leadership career, I should say, and they've already developed a bit of a style about them. And that style could be to mimic the behavior of those before them. But what if their first boss was a horrible boss? Does that mean that they're just going to blindly go and mimic the same behaviors of that horrible boss? Yes or no? And one of the things I saw in your workbook, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Tony, one of the things I saw in your workbook was exactly what Alisa was referring to there. Okay, what I observed was X. The characteristics I'm going to repeat myself are these ones, and the ones I'm never going to do are these ones. But we need to do that work, right? Tell us your experience there, Tony.
Absolutely. Conflict resolution, breaking that conflict cycle. It's skill development. Mm-hmm. We can learn, know thyself first. We can learn from these individuals. There comes a point in time, though, when we need to take personal responsibility for who we are, how we're growing, our actions. And I believe that when we go and we look at this as a skill development, how do I do conflict better? Because we're not going to be in places where there is no conflict. Alisa and I say this often. We'll hear from folks that are married folks who will go, oh, we haven't argued in years and years and years. And Alisa and I are thinking to ourselves, we're what's really going on? Because if you don't have any conflict, then you probably don't even care what's going on. And so I'd rather see some conflict happening, which Alisa and I still do 26 years in, but we learn. The skill development is, oh, wow, wait a minute. This is what I saw growing up. What did you see? Or from a leader, I stepped into my first job and this is what I learned from my boss or my supervisor. Is that who I really want to be 10 years later? Or maybe you're 10 years later from that. You jumped into the workforce at 20, now you're 30, maybe you're 35 and you're going, is that who I really want to be? And we believe that it's skill development and really looking at your past, realizing what you learned, and then moving forward and going, this is how I want to engage folks in my corporate setting or in my personal settings when it comes to conflict, and making those baby steps towards that.
Yeah, that's a great learning cycle there. And thinking about who do you want to be? How do you want others to see you? What leader do you want to be? Be the leader that you wish you always had, right? And the way you can do that is by learning from the good and bad and indifferent of the leaders before you. So remember those moments. And to borrow Maya Angelou here for a second, people may forget what you said, they may forget what you did, but they'll never forget how they made you feel. And think about that. Think about the leaders before you. How did they make you feel? What were the moments where they inspired you and you felt on top of the world? What were the moments when you felt less than, you felt belittled, you felt like you didn't matter? And what were the behaviors that led to that? And create yourself a bit of a checklist of your workbook kind of almost does this exactly thing. These are the things that I will do. These are the things that I won't do. And if you don't do that intentionally, you're going to wake up one day and go, oh, wow, I'm just like my former boss and I didn't even like him or her, right? Okay, really interesting. You also brought up an interesting interesting word before, Tony, and that was the word care. And if there's no conflict, is it a sign that someone doesn't care? That's a really interesting thought. And I'm going to say, once again, a workplace setting, that quite often people avoid those challenging conversations. And one of the reframes that I see, particularly if it's someone giving feedback, someone giving constructive feedback in the workplace, if someone has taken the time to share something with you and to have that challenging conversation, for me, that shows that their love and care for you is greater than their fear of the uncomfortable conversation. How does that sit with you? Tell us what that means to you.
I think that means a ton, because what goes through my mind, especially in the work environment, if somebody is done, they're not going to engage in conflict. They're trying to move away from it as much as they can because they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with the repercussions, and they're checked out as it is. And so for somebody to come up to me, even on our own team here at One Extraordinary Marriage, I'm always engaging our team members and asking what's going on. And we're completely remote. And so I'll get on calls with them. What's going on? How's it going? Tell me what you're seeing. What's something that's, on your heart? What do you see that we need to make changes to? And I'm always encouraging them to be open, honest, and transparent, just as we are with them, because then I know they care about what they're doing and we can make changes together. And I don't get upset. I don't get angry. I go, all right, let's come up with a plan so we can move in that direction. How do I help you move in that? I learned, and even in the work environment, when somebody would say something, to just rip off a quick message back to them all upset. And I've learned to just hear them out, write things down. If I can, address it right there and then give me some time to think through this issue, because it may take more than what we can handle right now. But I want to get back to you, because what you're sharing, you care about this. You care about One Extraordinary Marriage and what we're doing here. So I'm going to take time to respond in kind, you know what I mean? In listening and understanding.
I think there's two key takeaways there that are really interesting. I've not thought of this before, Tony. This is going to be one of my takeaways from today's discussion, that if there's an absence of conflict, it could be a sign of disengagement. So my antenna is going to be up for that. And then when there is someone that is actively bringing topics that we need to discuss to the table, it's because they care and they're engaged. It's not because they're a negative or a person that just wants to create trouble. No, it's because they care and they think that these issues are ones that we need to surface and discuss for the betterment of everyone, the betterment of the team, the betterment of the company, so that we can collectively do better. So that's a great takeaway for me today. Alisa, I'd like to come to you on this one. Now I want to talk about the differences. So we spoke before about, Tony coming from a loud background, you coming from one where that wasn't the norm. So you're now going to end up with a couple that has one model of conflict resolution and the other member of the couple has got a completely different model. I'm going to give you an example from my marriage here, and be careful here that we don't end up in live marriage counselling. But for Say and I, we have a mismatch of speed. So you talk about your cycle before. We don't have necessarily a mismatch of style, but we do have a mismatch of speed. So my cycle this is a learned behavior too, by the way. My cycle is faster. So she's going to be listening to this show. So I'm about to let her in on a little secret. I know little turns of phrases that she uses and even little audible sounds that she makes. They're not even words sometimes, where I know that I've upset her. And there's Filipino terms for this. Tampo, materai. Any Filipinos listening to the show know exactly what I'm talking about right now. And she'll say things like, I don't know, to you. And when she says those words, I know, oh, okay, I've done something wrong, have no idea what it is yet, and I want to go fast. I want to process it because I'm the one that doesn't know what the issue was. I want to surface it. I want to go, oh, I've clearly done something to upset you. What was it? But she's not ready. She's still processing. So we have a mismatch of speed. Tell us how we manage in these relationships, and this one is the intimate relationship, when we have a mismatch either of speed or technique for managing conflict.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for there to be a mismatch in speed.
We have.
Yes.
I'm like you, Mick.
You're describing Tony and Alisa.
Alisa's like that.
And
totally understand it.
What I started to discover, not only in our own marriage, but again, thousands and thousands of hours of working with couples, is that those two differences, let's say, so I referred in the book as fast processing and slow processing. There's no judgment there. It's just a speed thing. When you become aware of that, it can actually be a strength in your marriage to have that knowledge. And what I mean by that is it gives the two of you an opportunity to give one another exactly what the other person needs in order to get to conflict resolution. So meaning say needs a little time to process, right? That, it may come through turn of phrase. It may come from her saying, I don't know yet. Let me think about it. And you have the opportunity in that moment, even though everything in you wants to be like, let's just take care of this right now. Like, tell me what I did. Let me fix it. Let's just make this all better. You have the opportunity to give her the gift of time. And I often tell folks when they're in this type of conversation to imagine yourself handing over a little box all wrapped up with a bow. It just says, I would love to give you time so that you can think through this. Now, the person on the other end, in this case, Say or Alisa, who receives that gift of time, takes our time, we process, we work through our emotions, we figure out exactly what we were upset about or what happened. Then we have the opportunity to give the person that we're in relationship with the gift of re-engagement. And that is the cyclical gift. You have to give both. It's not fair. And I've told many of my coaching clients this. It's not fair if you're the one that's a little slower on the processing that you always get the gift of time, but you never give re-engagement because it becomes a very lopsided relationship. If you don't ever come back and close that circle and move to a place where we're re-engaging in the conversation, where we're talking about what happened when we're dealing with the emotions or what, upset her or upset me. Because if we just keep sweeping things under the rug, we're just like, oh, I got upset. Okay, I need time to think about it. And you don't come back. Then that's what really becomes toxic in a relationship, because then there are all of these conflicts that just kept, the elephants. If we talk about elephants in the room, you can only put so many elephants in your living room before there's no place for the two of you.
Yeah, really good. I love this re-engagement part. I think that's key because otherwise it will be unresolved and the list starts building up for sure. I'll tell you what my mind process goes through during that time because it is tough. And I think, Tony, you'll agree with this. When you're in those periods, and like I said, the Filipino term tampo is when your wife is just not even talking to you, right? So it can go several hours. Apparently, I don't get this as bad, but apparently in some couples it can go several days where your wife is just not talking to you. And when you don't know what you've done wrong, your mind is racing at 1,000 miles an hour going, was it something I said? Was it something I did? Did I forget to do something that I was supposed to do? Your mind is racing throughout that time. But here's how I process it, is I remember a quote from T.D. Jakes, which is never make a permanent decision based on a temporary emotion. And I play that in both ways. I think about myself, okay, so at the moment I'm tense, etc., etc. Do I want to say something that I will later regret based on this temporary emotion? And secondly, if I push Say and I say, no, I need to know right now what it is that I've done wrong, is she going to do the same in return? Is she going to say something that she later regrets because it's based on the temporary emotion? But I'm not talking about never processing it, because you need to come back and eventually talk about it, but now may not be the right time. So that's how I get through it. But I can tell you, Alisa, it's really tough to sit there and know you've done something wrong and not know what it is. That time, it can feel like an eternity. It might be 3 hours. It can feel like 3 days.
Well, what I found, Mick, is that when couples understand that they have to close that loop where it's not just getting the gift of time, or do you say tempo? When that happens, when it becomes both give and take, when that re-engagement happens, what I've seen with so many of the couples I've worked with is that that time can actually be shortened. And even going into that time, Say, or even myself can say, hey, this is what I'm processing right now. This is what I'm dealing with. I'm not ready to talk about all of the bits and pieces. But what I tell my couples, and I think this is so important, whether we're talking, professionally or personally, is here's what I'm processing, right? This is what I need to think through. This is where my, or emotion or whatever it is, to give something, because very much to your point, Mick, our imaginations are wonderful tools. It's how you become, such a powerful leader. You develop a leader because of all the creativity, the imagination, all of this that you have inside of you. But when you're in conflict with someone, that imagination turns into like the most epic story, film, novel of all of the what ifs and whatnots. And so I always tell the person that needs a little bit of time, like, just remember, you have to interrupt the screenwriting, because otherwise they're crafting a whole story about what it is that they've done. And if you don't interrupt that and just give them some context, then by the time you come back, they've crafted this whole narrative that may or may not be true. So there's a gift to the relationship to just say, hey, here's what I'm dealing with right now. I am going to be able to come back. Let me touch base with you and give a certain amount of time to at least have the initial, like, hey, I think I'm going to be ready in an hour or 2 hours. Okay, good. I'm just going to, but it's a give and take. It's not just one person always getting that, because the narrative, I tell my coaching clients all the time, I'm like, you guys should all be Hollywood screenwriters. We'd have like just award-winning movies everywhere with the narratives that get created.
Yeah. And the bigger thing for us, because I'm like you, let's get this, let's go, let's clean it up, let's rock and roll. But I've learned over the years that Alisa does process slower. There are things that she needs to work through. And there were times when she'd be there and I wouldn't know what was going on. And that is a tough place to be, because you are coming up with like, oh my gosh, is she going to divorce me? Is it this? Is it, and as the children came along, did I mess up with the children, or, whatever it may be. But the one thing that we have done, or the two things, is one, Alisa would share, hey, this is what I'm processing. One. Number two is that time, and putting some sort of time around it. So that way for myself beforehand, it just felt like it was just going on and on and on and on. And I didn't know if it was going to end in an hour or 3 days. And then this way we could come into an agreement for the most part to be able to go, let's circle back in, 2 hours, 24 hours, whatever feels necessary for wherever it may be. Because then for myself, then I could at least go, okay, I don't need to create this whole narrative. I can relax right now and know that she's going to come back and re-engage with me.
That's really cool. Another two powerful takeaways. And these are things that people listening at home, you can implement straight away. The first one, interrupt the script writing. And I can tell you that in that period where I don't know what I've done wrong, I'm starting to solve problems that aren't the real problem. In my head, I'm starting to extrapolate and go, oh, it's this. And I'll convince myself of a new narrative in my head that is not the real narrative, right? So interrupt the narrative, interrupt the script writing, and then ask for the time and time bound it and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking about. I don't want to talk about it right now. Let's get back together in 3 hours. I just need to think about this for a while. If that's the case, I will then, my blood pressure will go down because I go, okay, now I get it. I might even start practicing empathy, going, oh yeah, she's got a point. I can see why she might be upset with that, right? But now I'm on the right path. I'm not on my own narrative that I made up in my head. Yeah, that's really powerful.
And Mick, if we can extrapolate this to the business setting, right, into the corporate world, if you're in conflict with a colleague or, one of your subordinates or whatnot, if you don't tell them, it's the same thing. The narratives start getting created. And so this is where, as leaders, we need to be able to be very specific about what the conflict is, about where our disappointments are, whatever that might be, unmet expectations, so that we don't have employees who are creating their own narrative about possibly getting fired or, getting reassigned or whatever that potential negative outcome could be. Instead, we can be very specific with them. And how much can we shift a culture in a business if we get specific about that, so people understand and know, oh, we're going to circle back around to this in 24 hours, or give me 2 hours to think through possible solutions and I'll come back to take action on that.
I'm going to add something on that, Alisa. Sometimes it may not even be a conflict, but here's an example that I see show up in the workplace so often early in the day, and everyone gets in busy agendas and busy diaries. Someone will get a message from their boss, need to catch up with you for 15 minutes today. And that's it. And now what is and it could be that the person's talking about, hey, guess what? Got great news. You've been identified as a high potential. We're sending you on this wonderful trip, blah, blah, blah. It could be this huge pat on the back coming that person's way. For the rest of the day, they're going, oh, the boss needs 15 minutes of my time today. What have I done wrong? Right? So depending on their mindset and their upbringing and what they're used to, they might be dreaming up some kind of issue and how they're going to respond to the boss about topic X when topic X is not even on the table, right? So it doesn't even have to be a conflict for you to put someone in that state where they start getting nervous about the conversation you're going to have later that day. How does that sit with you?
Well, I think it highlights the fact that what is the culture of communication within an organization? How do we communicate? If we understand that so many people will go to the negative in the absence of information, then it allows us as leaders to say, how do I communicate with this person to interrupt their thought pattern if the potential is there, if I'm too vague and the potential is there for this to be a negative thought. And so I actually, when I hear you say that, I find it very empowering for every leader listening to this podcast to say, I can step up. I can level up how I communicate with the people that I work with my teams, et cetera, to minimize those negative feelings, to minimize potential conflict, and to actually shift the culture within our organization if I'm just more specific.
Let's unpack that a little bit. So you've used the word vague, you've used the word specific, and I'll share another observation that I see. I guess I'm privy to a lot of conversations that have got a HR bent to them, let's say. And I'll see a lot of conversations where a leader, sometimes a senior leader, sometimes a junior leader, will be sitting in front of HR and going, I've got this performance issue with staff member XYZ. And in that discussion in behind closed doors with HR or with me or whoever the case may be, they will be quite specific. This is what they did, and this is the impact of what's happening. This is the situation. This is the behavior. This is the impact, and this is how it's affecting me. It's how it's affecting others in the team, etc., etc. But then when you plug a little bit and go, okay, so how have you addressed this with them? What have you discussed? The lack of specificity in terms of how they then addressed it with the individual becomes a problem, because when you unravel it a little bit, the conversation that they've had with them has been more vague and less specific. So what tips can you have for leaders out there about, instead of just being specific behind closed doors, about going to the individual and say, hey, when you behaved like that, it had this impact?
Well, I think, what's true in marriage is true in corporate, right? It's true in the workplace. And that's the more specific we can be with the people that we're in relationship with, the greater likelihood that they can address those behaviors and create a change. If we're vague interpersonally or professionally, and yet we have these expectations that somebody's going to make a monumental change, we're setting them up for failure and setting ourselves up for frustration. And so it's being willing to be specific and to say this behavior, not, hey, could you talk nicer? It's no, when you use this language or this tone of voice, or when you are short with the secretary or whatever it is, that doesn't work in this organization. Here's how we talk to our secretaries. Here's how we talk to, the janitor. Here's how we, our tone of voice or how we're going to address colleagues. Now, all of a sudden, that person on the receiving end of that has a choice to make because we've been specific on what our expectations are. But if we're not specific on our expectations, it's very hard for those that we're called to lead to actually know what it is that we're asking for.
Now that's actionable. That's actionable. Like if you say someone, you're just too disruptive in meetings, that's not going to help them. But if you say, hey, when you did this in this meeting, you actually interrupted Sally who was in the middle of an important point. How do you think Sally felt about it? Right? So you're now being specific. Oh yeah, I didn't even realize. And you're raising their self-awareness, whereas vague statements confuse them. It doesn't raise their self-awareness. Yeah, this is really powerful, Alisa. I love it. All right, I want to come back to mismatch again. Now in the workplace, the other mismatch that we see a lot is cultures. And I'm not talking about the culture of the business now. I'm talking about most businesses these days are very multicultural. And I'm not trying to be stereotypical here. I'm talking about what people have grown up with and what they've seen, what they've learned as a behavior. So let's just say Japanese and German. Let's just pick those two cultures. So if you've got two people in your team, one's Japanese, one's German, there is a high likelihood, once again, avoiding stereotypes, everyone is different, but there's the high likelihood that the Japanese person is more an indirect culture and the German person comes from a very direct culture. How do you manage that in the workplace?
Well, I think, some of this is understanding, and it goes back to what I was saying about marriage. Where is your curiosity factor about learning across cultures? Not making the assumption that everyone handles situations the way your culture does, because it's very easy. And I think, this is what we're living in 2023. We are in a multicultural, multinational world where people are interacting all the time. And if we just stay in this place of everybody's got to be just like me, it's a very myopic view. And it shortchanges the ability to look at that and go, okay, what are the strengths in how your culture handles conflict? Okay, we've got somebody that's very direct. Well, then you're probably always going to know exactly what that person is upset about or what they want. Or if you've got a more cultural bent towards being indirect, well, how can we see that and position that as a strength? Okay, well, we're dealing with these situations. We may actually have, as you were giving the examples, we may have the person in the Japanese culture be the one to present because it will be potentially a softer approach. But we use that to understand that all of these strengths, all of these differences can be superpowers within the organization. We can use it to forward our common goal. And it means that we have to understand, we have to make the choice. And I do want to say it's a choice to understand that people are different than we are and to be that bridge to them to say, this is how I approach things. How do you typically approach things? Because I can sense the conflict. I can sense the tension between the two of us, and we're colleagues. I don't want to be in tension with you. I want to understand that if I'm doing something that culturally, this is how I I do things and it's upsetting to you, it would be helpful if you told me that, because I'm not a mind reader. This is what I've grown up in. This is what I know. And I don't, so it has to go both ways. There has to be the curiosity and there has to be the offering of, maybe you don't know this about my culture. Let me share with you.
Yeah, powerful communication. So staying curious about the other person and being specific about your own needs, about your own expectations, about your own boundaries. And you do talk about boundaries in your books as well. So then don't expect that someone else is a mind reader, right? And you don't know what's going on in their mind. So you stay curious for their mind and then be specific with them about, well, actually, this is how I felt when you did that. Or when this happened, this is how I felt, rather than making it an accusation. A good I statement talks about, I felt this way. And no one can deny your feelings. You're just expressing how you felt in that situation. Yeah, really, really good, Alisa. Now, coming back to the cycle, what I'm curious about now is any tips that you can have for either couples or leaders and businesses to take your pattern that you've shown in terms of this conflict cycle. How do you turn that into a virtuous process where you do it very intentionally and go, right, we're in a conflict cycle here. This is how we're going to deal with it, and use that cycle as a evaluating process?
Well, I want to share, there's a line that I put in the book that says issues can either be landmines or gold mines. You're either mining for treasure or you're blowing things up. That's pretty much, by it. And so understanding, like Tony said earlier, that conflict in and of itself is not bad. It's good when an organization is challenged. It's good when you've created a culture where people on the team, because they care so much, don't just want to go along with the status quo. They want to ask questions. They want to present different ideas, and you've created a space for them to do so. So it's looking at that and saying, hey, if we're having a moment of conflict, if there's a situation where we're sitting around the board table or the coffee table or wherever it might be, and there's a difference of opinion, what can we learn from this situation? What do we need to learn about our organization? Maybe there's a system that's broken within the organization. What do we need to learn about, our customers? Maybe we're running into situations where we're having the same conflicts with the customers, and we need to either address the system or we need to address who we're attracting to our business and why they seem to be having all the same problem. Or maybe there's a situation within the team, and we need to address who's on the team and what position they're in, and are they in the right position? Because sometimes there can be conflicts with team members, and it could just be the fact that you've got the right person in the wrong position. And so looking at that, but if we as leaders look at conflict and say, you know what, we're having this situation here. What can I gather? What is the treasure in this conflict that is going to make us as an organization better? Then we don't have to shy away from the conflict. We don't have to squelch the conflict. We can actually say, you know what, there's a learning opportunity here. I want us as a team culturally to say, what can we learn in this moment that is going to make us better, stronger, more dynamic, more efficient, whatever the end result could be.
I feel like there's multiple levels of learning there, Alisa. One is the learning about what are we learning from this conflict, and the second one is what are we learning about conflict. And the more you pay attention, the more you're going to resolve the elephants in the room we spoke about before, unresolved things that have been sitting around dormant in the business, limiting beliefs that have been holding the business back because no one's been talking about it. So we're going to benefit from the conflict itself from a learning point of view. And then the more we practice it, the better we'll get at it. So we're also learning about conflict every time we do it. How does that sit with you?
It reminds me, as you say that, and just hearing those words back, that we as leaders need to not sit on autopilot leading our organizations. Because when we're on autopilot, then we just spin on these conflicts. We squelch things we don't want to pay attention to. We do all this kind of, but when we get off of autopilot and say, I'm going to be fully engaged, fully present, and I'm going to go after learning what's currently happening in my organization, then what shifts? What shifts if we're not just checking in every day, but we're actively engaged in what's going on and why it's happening in our organization?
Yeah, this is really powerful. Some statements that we've used on the show before, limiting beliefs kill more dreams than failure ever did. And in a limiting belief in a business are those hidden things that no one is talking about that are stopping the business from going forward. So you're talking about getting off autopilot and intentionally almost creating the conflict, bringing it to the surface so we can talk about the things that are holding the business back. And if we don't, they'll always be sitting there like an anchor around our necks, stopping us from growing to the heights that we want to grow to. Yeah, really powerful. So I'm going to sum up my takeaways from this episode. I'm going to say in one statement, there's multiple things along the way about, staying curious and about learning about how we manage conflict, etc. I'm going to sum it up in this way and say, having a healthy relationship with conflict creates healthy relationships.
Yeah.
100%.
All right. Well, thank you so much, you two. I adore you two. Huge fans. You're a great inspiration to us. We normally at this point do our rapid round. You've already answered those questions. So I'm going to surprise you with one new one that I've never asked anyone before. And then we'll talk about the new book and how people find it and the workbook, et cetera, et cetera. So replacing the question we've asked you before is, what's one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20? I'm going to say, when you're 60, how do people refer to Alisa and Tony DiLorenzo? What is your dream of what they'd be saying about you?
This actually makes me emotional. And the reason that I say that is because we've already started getting some of what I think we'll get when we're 60. It'll just be bigger. And that is that you changed our life, that you changed generations in our family. We had the privilege last year, Tony co-officiated 2 weddings for sisters who their parents found One Extraordinary Marriage about 10 years ago, 8 to 10 years ago. And because of the impact that one had on their parents, they wanted us to be a part of their own weddings. So generational changers.
Yeah. And I was going to say legacy builders. That's what I see is just leaving a legacy that others want to grab a hold of. And they want to then leave that legacy to their family line and change what they grew up with and go, we love our families. We love who raised us. And yet we want more. We want to grow. We want to be different. We want to leave a legacy that impacts our children and our children's children and all the way down the line.
So I'll go out on a limb and say both of those things will be true. There's no doubt you're already impacting many people's lives positively, and you will be leaving a legacy behind you that people will be talking about your work for many generations to come. The 6 pillars of intimacy, how to manage conflict. This is work for the ages that people can pass on. And I love you've already got that generational impact. You know, the parents that said, hey, to their daughters, this is how you build an extraordinary marriage. So you're already having that generational impact, but I think that's going to go across multiple generations as your books are passed from parents to children to grandchildren to great-grandchildren. So congratulations on the impact that you have. I think it's just amazing. So that does lead us to the point. The floor is yours at this point. You tell the audience what is the best way for them to engage with you, how to find the new book, how to find the workbook, how to enroll in the programs around your group coaching, et cetera, et cetera. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. So to get 6 Pillars of Intimacy Conflict Resolution, you can go to conflictresolutionbook.com. Within the book, we have a free download for the workbook, and we highly encourage that you go get it and work through it together or even individually, because it's going to just make the experience so much richer for you as you grow. And if you want to learn more about us, what we do, everything else, you can go to oneextraordinarymarriage.com.
All right. Thank you so much. And when you do get the books, remember, this is going to help your personal lives, your personal relationships, whatever those intimate relationships you're in. It'll help with relationships with your children too. It's not just about your loving relationships. And you can see in this discussion that the 3 of us have had today, all of the lessons in there are able to be extrapolated into the workplace so that you can show up as a better leader, a more intentional leader, a leader that brings conflict intentionally to the surface for the betterment of everyone. So thank you so much, you two. I just adore you. Thank you so much for your time again today and for bringing your wisdom and insights to our audience.
Always a pleasure, Mick. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mick.
Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mickspears.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content, and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo, and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.